All right, we can get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Putting the Story in Family History. I'm Amy Boxrud, Executive Director of the Norwegian American Historical Association here in Northfield, Minnesota. If you're already familiar with NAHA, you know that preserving and sharing stories is a really important part of our work. So we are very excited to be able to share this content with you today. I'd like to say hello and thank you to our members who are joining us from coast to coast and even in Norway today. So welcome, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. Whether your ancestry is from Norway or anywhere else in the world, we're really glad you're here. I'd like to take a minute to introduce my colleague, NAHA archivist Christina Warner. She's a great resource if you have questions about materials in the archives, or if you have unique historical materials that need a safe home. She would be happy to have a conversation with you. So Christina, what is the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Yeah, the best way to get in touch with me is via email. So after this webinar, we will follow up with everyone. We will email you with our contact information, Rachel's information, and the link to the recording of this. So you'll be able to find me that way.
Great. And if you haven't visited our website, I invite you to check that out later. You can search our archival collections. You can find recordings of this and past events. And you can learn about 2 new research fellowships that we're offering for 2024. And you can also become a member if you're not already a member, or you can give a gift membership to someone else. And I have to say, it's a great time to become a member, because now, between now and May 15th, if you become a member, you will receive this book if you'd like it. And that is Colonel Hans Christian Haag and the Norwegian American Experience, written by our former editor, Odd Lovell. So there's never been a better time to be a member. If you aren't, we welcome you. At the end of the presentation, we'll leave time for questions. If you hover your mouse over at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a toolbar, and there should be a Q&A button there. You should be able to type and submit your question at any point during the presentation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce author, historian, and writing instructor, Dr. Rachel Hanel. Dr. Hanel is associate professor at Minnesota State University-Mankato. She holds a BA in Mass Communications and History and an MA in History, both from Minnesota State University-Mankato. And she earned a PhD in creative writing from Bath Spa University. Over the course of her career, Rachel has written more than 20 nonfiction books for children. And her most recent work is called Not the Camilla We Knew: One Woman's Life from Small Town America to the Symbionese Liberation Army. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to learn more about Rachel and her work at rachelhanel.com. So I will turn things over to you. Welcome, Rachel, and take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Amy, for having me here today. I'm very excited to talk more about family stories and how to create something that is just lovely out of family stories. So I have a presentation that I will share with you. So I will share my screen and get started with that. So hopefully you can see that there. I think I will do my slideshow. And like Amy had said, if you have any questions as I'm going through this presentation, please put them in the Q&A box. I think we'll mostly save questions until the end, unless there's a question that where you need a point of clarification or anything like that, then we can try to address it at that point. But yes, at the end, I would love to take questions. I would love to have a discussion. So as I'm going through this, if anything comes to mind, please jot a couple of things down. And I also have a couple of slides where I invite you to think about things maybe a couple of little writing exercises. So we'll get to that point as well. I'm really happy to be here. I am not Norwegian, so don't hold that against me. I'm primarily German and Irish. So thank you for letting me come to this group to talk about putting the story in family history. So like Amy said, I have a background in journalism and history. That's really where I started. So my bachelor's degree is in journalism and history. I always knew that I wanted to write. I loved writing. I loved reading. I really loved true stories. My family, when I was growing up, we had newspapers in the house every day. I watched a lot of TV news. This was back in the day where you didn't get many channels. So you just were watching the news. It was just going to be on TV. And I was really intrigued by family stories. I was intrigued by current events. And I thought, well, if I like to write and I like current events, maybe I'll go into journalism. So I knew that from a really young age that I wanted to work as a newspaper reporter. So when I went to college, that was initially my first major. And then I was a history minor just because I loved history. And I remember looking through the course catalog and looking at the history classes to take. I think I only had to take 5 as a minor. And I thought, well, I want to take them all. This will never do. I want to take way more than 5 classes. So I thought, well, why not? I'll just be a history major as well. So that's how my double major came to be. I was working at the newspaper and I wanted to go back to school for a master's degree. I didn't really have any clear plans for that. I just knew that I liked school and that eventually at some point in my life, a master's degree might be handy, even though I didn't have really any clear plans for how I would use it. So I went back to school to get that master's degree in history. At that point, I was working in journalism yet, and I really didn't have any idea about the world of creative writing. I really had tunnel vision in terms of thinking of myself as a newspaper reporter and as a journalist. I didn't think anything about memoir. I didn't really think anything about narrative nonfiction. So that's why when I went back to get my master's degree, it was in history because I didn't even really know the options that were available for creative writing. So when I was getting my history degree, you can see the book there that is on the left will be the last ones to let you down. I started to work on that book, and it is a memoir. My dad was a gravedigger, and he and my mom also mowed and maintained cemeteries. So I spent a lot of time in cemeteries, and I have a feeling in this group today, there's probably plenty of you out there who also have spent a lot of time in cemeteries. We know to do family research, that's one place where you're going to go and find some information. So I grew up in that environment, and I think that's what really sparked my interest in history, because all around me, I could see these people who had lived in the same place I had lived, and they had had lives, and I just wanted to know more about them. So it was really quite a unique perspective growing up to be so young and growing up in a cemetery like that. So that is really how I got the idea to write the memoir. And so this is the book I will be referencing, will be the last ones to let you down a little bit more during this presentation than my other latest book, just because will be the last ones to let you down does specifically deal with family stories. And so I can tell you some of the tactics I used to try to bring those family stories to life. But then, as Amy mentioned, my latest book is a work of narrative nonfiction. So it's more of researching a woman's life. It's more of a biography. The main character of this book, Camilla Hall, she is not a relative, so it wasn't my own family story that I was looking at, but in many ways, it still is a family story, with how she went from growing up as a pastor's daughter in small town Minnesota to moving out to California in the 70s and becoming wrapped up in a radical revolutionary group and losing her life because of that. So that's a little of my background that I have here. So one thing I do want to start with is I just want to talk a little bit more about creative nonfiction, because if you aren't in the world of creative writing, this term might be a little unknown to you, or maybe a little nebulous. Exactly what are we talking about when we talk about creative nonfiction? So journalism is one thing. I think we understand what journalism is and that type of nonfiction, but to take it to another level and making it creative, what does that involve? So there's a few different things that we can think about when we look at creative nonfiction. So we have the facts. So when you think of your journalistic report, or you're doing research into family stories, you have kind of these basic facts about the people that you're looking at. You have those facts, and you could write something from that. But what takes it to that next level would be you as the author, you as the writer, offering some insight into those facts. So you have the facts, but what does it mean? What are you learning from it? What things have surprised you about this? You know, having your voice in there is really critical. So we can also think of it as the author's interpretation. We have all of these facts in front of us, but what does it mean? We might need the writer to come in there to let the reader know, okay, here's what it means. It also means, in that creative sense, that you're paying attention to the language. So you are thinking more critically about word choice, about sentences, sentence structure, varying the length of the sentence. You're thinking about the organization. How do you want to present this information? In what order do you want to present it? For example, you could present the story of somebody's life in strict chronological order. That's an option. But sometimes, to make it more creative and more compelling for the reader, maybe you start in the middle with a really dramatic scene from the middle of somebody's life. Maybe you start at the very end. Maybe there's a dramatic death scene that you want to start with, and then go back to the beginning. So those kind of options are all creative as well. When I talk about creative nonfiction, sometimes people hear that word creative and they think, oh, that means I can make it up, or I can fictionalize. But we still always have to come back to that word of nonfiction. So we are working with the truth. We're not embellishing. We're not making things up, but we are making these creative choices to try to make these facts as compelling as possible. There's also this issue of, on the page, doing some wondering, and I also call it wandering. So these things that you might wonder when you're doing family research. Oh, I wonder what he or she was thinking. I wonder what happened here. I wonder what caused this event to happen. To actually put that on the page and to see you as the author wondering about those things, and then also wandering, you know, maybe thinking about many different scenarios of why this thing may have happened, or why this person was the way they are. That also is going to make a work of nonfiction more creative. And then a really key element of creative nonfiction is having that emotional piece present. So I've talked about the facts. We can have the facts in front of us, but stories of people are so emotional and they're so dramatic. So is there a way to capture that emotion and drama on the page? That's going to make it more creative nonfiction. You generally don't find that kind of emotion in journalistic accounts, maybe in more traditional academic writing. You're not going to find a lot of that emotion. So that's where creative nonfiction can come in and fill out that piece of the puzzle. So we do have the writer's voice in creative nonfiction. So again, journalism, academic writing, we may have been taught to keep your voice out of that. But in creative nonfiction, to see the writer thinking on the page, to see the writer's observations, that is really a critical piece of this genre. And also, we want to think about these stories as journeys. And so you have the journey of the person that you're writing about. You know, they were born, they had a life, they died, that's their journey. But then you coming in as the writer and seeing you on your journey as you're uncovering this information about the person and what you're learning as you're doing this, and how each layer of information that you come across is adding to your understanding of that person. That is also a really compelling story for the reader, just to see you as the writer. What are you learning as this goes on? So with my second book, the one about Camilla Hall, I really took this path where, yes, we have Camilla's story, but I'm doing research on her. So as I'm going to college archives to try to find information, as I'm looking at old newspapers, I'm learning new things about her every step of the way as well. And so readers of this book are also seeing me discover things about Camilla. And I do a lot of that wondering and that wandering on the page in the process. I do think that this is becoming a more popular style of writing. And so I've been talking about traditional media or traditional journalism, where maybe this really wasn't the style. But I read a lot of media. I read the New York Times, I read the Atlantic, and I'm seeing so much more of this really personal take on issues that are going on, this really personal take on when people are writing about other people, like profiles and that kind of thing. So I think it is because this kind of style of writing is more emotional and therefore I think more captivating for readers. So I think a lot of you have probably done some genealogical research. And when you do that, you're coming across a lot of facts, like I was talking about before. So you are accustomed to working with dates, you're working with people's names, and you have places. So from that information, you can glean quite a bit, right, about a person's life. So with all of that information, you can compile a report, what I would call a report. So-and-so was born, they married this person, they had these kids, they lived here, maybe they, emigrated to the United States and then they lived here. So we kind of have that report, and it's factual and it's correct, but it's not really, it's dry, right? It's not the most compelling thing for other people to read. So from that, you want to have a little bit more going on here. So what does that look like? I'm going to take an example that I have from my book, Will Be the Last Ones to Let You Down, where I do go into more detail about a family story. So my grandparents lived in southern Minnesota outside of a small town. So the time period is 1933. So we have a date, we have names, Anna and Henry Hager. And at that time, they had 4 little girls. They had just been married 5 years, but already had 4 children. So the baby at this time, Mary Jean, was born in June of 1933. And at that same time, Lucille was about 1.5 years old, and she had whooping cough. So if you know anything about 1933, it was a whooping cough epidemic was going on, at least here in the United States. So they brought the baby home, even though my grandma didn't want to. She knew that the other baby was sick. She had real concerns about bringing an infant back home. She tried to get somebody else to take the baby so it wouldn't be in that house, but she was reassured by nurses and doctors. Neighbors said, no, it's fine. It's fine. The baby can be at home. The baby won't be sick, etc. Well, the baby did get sick. So Lucille, the older daughter, had died in August. The baby was home. The baby contracted whooping cough, and then the baby died in October. And my grandparents were farmers, so they didn't have a lot of money. So for the funerals, they had to borrow money from my grandma's brother. And then for the funeral, the burial dresses, my grandma had to cut up her wedding dress in order to make burial gowns for these babies. So these are the facts, okay, right? We have names, we have dates, we have an event. So what I would ask of you to just contemplate here, what can you infer? There's a lot that we can infer from these particular events. And this is what I tried to do when I was writing my book. So my book is about growing up in the cemetery, being really surrounded my entire life with grief and loss. I was able to witness those emotions all the time from a very young age. So I had kind of this witnessing that was going on. My dad died when I was 15, so I had my own personal experience of grief and loss, but I also had these family stories. So this would be one example from my paternal grandparents, where they had lost these 2 babies in the span of just a few months in 1933. My paternal grandfather's parents died in the 1918 influenza epidemic. He was 6 years old. So his parents died, left orphans, of him and his siblings. So I also had these family stories of grief and loss that I wanted to include in the book. But again, I could just say, here's what happened. I could have this paragraph in the book and I could just leave it at that. but something's missing. You know, if we want to make it more compelling and more a piece of creative nonfiction, what can we infer from this? So what I really tried to do, knowing this family story, is I tried to imagine myself as my grandmother. And I think there's logical things that we can infer as human beings presented with information like that. So clearly, my grandma is going to be filled with grief, right? I mean, to lose two babies in the span of a couple of months must have just been an enormous, unimaginable loss. To have to go to your wedding dress that I'm sure you were thinking of keeping as a family heirloom to pass down, to go to that and actually have to cut it up and take a scissors and make that first cut that's going to damage the dress. That must have been so emotional. But also they're farmers. They're poor. They can't take time off. You know, that was not a concept to take 1 or 2 weeks off to grieve this loss. So immediately they would have had to go right back to work. They had 2 little girls. So 2 girls died, but they still had these other 2 little girls. My grandma had to take care of them and make their food and bake and do all of that. So I really just tried to put myself to see the situation in my grandma's eyes. And I wrote an entire chapter thinking about what this must have felt like for her. And again, do I know this? I don't know this. My grandma died. By the time I'm writing the book, grandma's gone. I can't ask her how she exactly was feeling during this time or what her thoughts were. But based on these facts, I can logically make an inference of how she was feeling. And that's how I chose to write that chapter. And this would be an example of taking the facts of a family story and making them more into creative nonfiction. So getting back to kind of this concept of doing something like that or creative nonfiction, there are some different thoughts about this approach, and it's a very personal choice, and it's a personal choice as the reader, and it's also a very personal choice as the writer. So I say here there's 2 approaches to family stories. I mean, really, there's much more. It's more on a spectrum. So what you see in this slide is a representative of the spectrum of what I would call creative nonfiction. So on one side, you have somebody like Sam Friedman. He worked for a long time as a journalist, I think for the Wall Street Journal, and he wanted to write about his mother. So I think he was 20 when his mother died. So he was just starting to learn about his mother as an adult when she died. And as he got older, he realized, wow, I really don't know a lot about my mom. But I knew she had a really interesting life. So I want to go back and see what I can find and try to recreate that. So he wrote a book called Who She Was, and it's a very journalistic approach, but yet it is still creative nonfiction because it's really compelling. It's really interesting. He's a good writer. He's making, great choices in terms of writing and words and sentences and the structure of the book. It's really good that way. But he also was trying to honor his journalistic roots. So when you read the book, he has an afterword where he explains very clearly he only has information in here that could be documented. He doesn't take any imaginative leaps. He doesn't go into his mother's point of view to imagine how she was thinking. It is very journalistic, really using the sources at hand to document her life, but it still is no less compelling. It's still a very good book. And then you have the other end of the spectrum. I put a book on here by a woman named Nicole Helget. She lives here in southern Minnesota as well. So her book, The Summer of Ordinary Ways, is about growing up in a farm family in southern Minnesota in the 1980s. So her book is full of family stories and her memories of growing up in that environment. And it's not always rosy. It's not always beautiful and wonderful. There's really, quite a bit of darkness in this book, but she is very imaginative. She is really, really good writer in terms of language and lyricism. She does a lot of that imagining the point of view from her mom and from her dad. She's doing a lot of that wondering and wandering on the page. Including a lot of emotions and including a lot of suppositions and inferences in this book. So these really are two good examples of family stories and different approaches you can take. Now, some people would argue that something on the far end of the spectrum, like Nicole's book, or even my book, can you call that nonfiction? Since you cannot document emotions and you can't document inferences, can you still call it nonfiction? I think somebody like Sam Friedman would say, no, you have gone into territory that you can't document, therefore you can't call it nonfiction anymore. But those of us who do practice maybe on that other end of the spectrum, we're still adhering to the facts and we still are making logical inferences about emotions. And there's some key words that you can use. So it's kind of like maybe hedging your bets a little bit. So if you do want to take those imaginative leaps, you can use some key phrases like, I imagine, or perhaps it was this way, or maybe she was thinking that. So you're signaling to the reader that you don't know for sure, but you are making that creative, imaginative leap into somebody's state of mind. So that's where the writers of nonfiction will use phrases like that to just kind of signal to the reader that, okay, we don't know, but this is maybe how it could have been. Not everyone's going to agree with that. So I teach this a lot, this concept. And so I just always tell my students, that's your decision as a writer, because this is a creative art, just like painting or music or theater or anything like that. You are the artist. So you get to do what you want to do to make what you think is a compelling piece of art. Not everybody has to agree with you. So if a reader doesn't agree with you, if a reader doesn't like that approach, well, the reader is free to not read it. So readers also have to make those decisions. So if you aren't a writer, but you're a reader of creative nonfiction, you also have to make a decision as to what you're comfortable with reading. Sam Friedman maybe isn't comfortable reading a book like Nicole Helget's book, and that's his right as a reader, just like it's Nicole's right as a writer to write the story the way that she sees fit in an artful way. There's also a couple of concepts here that we want to keep in mind when writing creative nonfiction that can help us think about kind of that whole facts plus emotional aspect of it. And it's the inner story and the outer story. So with an outer story, I call that the obvious story. It's really the facts. So it's the story you see at the surface, and it's also the part of the story that can be documented. So if you have dates and you have names and you have places, those all can be documented as fact. So great, we have this outer story of this factual information. To make it creative nonfiction, to take that leap, you need to also think about this inner story. So this is what I've been talking about, the inferences we can make from the facts. And it's really the so what. Every writer of creative nonfiction has to ask themselves the question, so what? What does this story mean? And it might sound a little harsh, but you can ask that of anything. If you even think about my story, my memoir, my dad was a gravedigger. I grew up in cemeteries. My dad died when I was 15. Those are the facts. I have to ask myself, well, so what? So what? In order to make other people care about it and want to read it, I have to figure out what's that inner meaning, what's that deeper story. And so as I'm writing it, what I'm coming across is more of this universal story. It's a story about grief. It's a story about loss. It's a story about hope, but that's a story everyone can relate to because we've all gone through that. We've all had grief in our life and we've all had losses. So suddenly my really specific story becomes more of a universal story, but only through that so what, only through answering the so what and trying to figure out what that inner story is. There's an exercise that I like to do, and I can share this all with you later too, but something that maybe you just want to jot down now and you can practice it later. But it's a really good exercise to help you start to think about the difference between the inner story and the outer story. So I often ask people when I give workshops, I say, think about a memory that is just sticking in your mind that you can't let go. Maybe you come to it over and over again. It's just something that's with you quite often. Or it might also be an object. So if it's an object in your house that you want to cling to, you don't want to get rid of, maybe you've moved a lot, you always take this object with you. Maybe it's an object where your friends and family say, why are you keeping that thing? It might not have any meaning to anyone else. That can also be a good prompt for this exercise. So yes, either an image that is sticking with you or this object that you're reluctant to part with. And then what I ask people to do is just jot down a few notes about that, like just pure description. What is this memory? What's going on? Who's there? Where are you? What time is it? What year is it? Or with the object, what does the object look like? How big is it? Can you just describe it visually? So I have people do that. And then I guess I don't have the second part of it, but the second part would be, okay, you've described it. Now, what does it mean? So with a memory, why do you think you keep thinking about it? Or with an object, why do you still hang on to it? So it was really an exercise like this where my memoir started. So I was in a creative writing class as part of my graduate program, and we had to write an essay. And I decided to write about this image that I just could not forget. And it was an image, it was a photograph on a gravestone in one of the cemeteries that we took care of. And this is the late 1970s. And so for some of you who are familiar with cemeteries, you know that back then, it was kind of rare to have a photo on a gravestone. And when you did have a photo on a gravestone, it was an actual photo, right? Nowadays you have the technology where you can do all sorts of wonderful etching on gravestones and have a lot of photos and images. But back then it was pretty rare. So it was a photo of a young woman, about 15 years old, and she was just beautiful. Her name was Vicky, and this picture is just so beautiful. And I'm very young when I come across this, and I just loved looking at her picture, but she was dead. She was in the cemetery. She had this gravestone. So I wrote this essay about being really fascinated with her picture. So I described it, and I described the gravestone. And then I had to think about, okay, what does this mean? Why was I so fascinated with this photograph of Vicky? Why did I keep thinking about it all of these years later? And really, it became that it was my first introduction to mortality, and specifically my first introduction to this idea that young people can die. Vicky was only 15. So that was a really important lesson for me to learn early, and it kind of shaped my entire worldview growing up. So it became a really important image to write about. And I wrote it, and I decided from that I could write a whole book, because there were more examples like that in my life where I came across things in the cemetery and they actually ended up meaning something. So that's just an example of taking that memory or image and trying to figure out, okay, what does it mean? One thing that I do want to talk about as well is thinking about, especially for those of you who might be interested in writing more about family stories, is a couple of differences here that are important to keep in mind. So we have memoir or essay, and then we have family history. And I separated them out here. Of course, they can combine, but just to kind of see the difference of what we're talking about here. And when I give this workshop, instead of family history, I usually call it autobiography. So that difference between memoir versus autobiography. So you can think of it that way too. But when you're writing a memoir or writing an essay, and if you were to write a family memoir, really the hallmark of a memoir is that there's a central theme. And you're carefully selecting stories that all relate to that theme. And as you can see on the other side, versus a family history might be anecdotal. You might have a lot of different stories about this family. And also it's going to be all encompassing. It might be from the very beginning of somebody's life to the very end, or an entire family history from as far back as you can go up into the present, kind of this larger span of time. Whereas a memoir is going to be much more focused. So my memoir is about grief and loss. That is the central theme. So anything in the book that is about family or about myself is going to relate back to that theme. Of course, I could have written a lot more. I had a lot of other things happen to me in my life besides just growing up in a cemetery. I could have written about a lot of other relatives, have a lot of family stories. But if they didn't fit into that theme, I wasn't going to include them. And a memoir or an essay, if you're writing just a shorter piece, it's going to have that larger theme. So like I was talking about with that inner story, what's that theme that is able to connect this family story that makes it so everybody would be interested? And when you have that, you're going to have that chance to appeal to a larger audience because they may not know you, they may not know your family, but you've written about a theme they can connect with. Whereas on the other side, if you're talking about just a family history, and you have a lot of those anecdotes that are more just family stories, but they're kind of all over the place. They're not related to one specific theme. It's a pretty limited audience, and it's going to be an audience of family members. Like, of course, family members are going to be really interested in what you've uncovered about family history. But if there's not something bigger there, you're not going to have a larger audience. And I have a slide, probably in a couple of slides coming up, where I talk more about that. Who's your audience? So when you sit down to write a family history, you have to think first and foremost, who do you want to read this? Who legitimately would be interested in this? When you are writing about family, there are some trouble spots that you have to watch out for. So I'm just going to go over these really briefly, just so you can keep them in mind. And if you need to do further research, if you're going to be talking or be writing more about family, you'd want to dig a little bit deeper into some of these potential problems that you might run into. And for some of you who are already doing family research, you are already going to be familiar with some problem areas that can pop up. So first, one problem is just the nature of memory. Our memories are fickle. Our memories are unreliable. If I went to a family dinner and we had a conversation, and I went home and I recounted it, and then my sister recounted it, my mom recounted it, we're all going to have three different perspectives on what happened at that family dinner, what was said, who said what. I'm sure you all can relate to that conflict of memory. That's just how memory works. So when you're writing memoir, you have to keep that in mind. But getting back to that point of nonfiction, nobody can argue with your memory. You know, as long as you are writing it in a way that you truly remember it that way, and you're not making anything up, and you're not purposely fictionalizing something, that's your memory. That's how you remember it. Nobody can say that you're wrong. So you have some protection there. For those of you doing research, you do know also that primary sources can be problematic. Just because somebody wrote something or just because something exists in an archive doesn't make it suddenly, you know, just, wow, nobody can dispute this. We know that people, again, with the faulty memories, primary sources aren't always reliable either. So we have to go into the research and the writing, knowing that as well. There's going to be legal issues. So again, I don't want to act like I'm a lawyer here or anything, but if you wanted to do some more research about it and you are writing family stories, this would be only for people who are still living. If you were writing about people still living, you can't libel or defame the dead. But we have issues such as libel, such as invasion of privacy, and such as defamation that we do have to be aware of when we're writing. At least here in the United States, the First Amendment is really pretty protective of freedom of speech and of writers. So it's usually pretty difficult to actually be sued and lose a legal case in terms of writing, but of course it does happen. But even if you're fine on the legal side of things, you're not breaking any laws or nobody's suing you, there's ethical issues that you want to consider as well. So there's ethical issues regarding privacy. Do these families want those stories out there? Maybe the stories aren't always the most wonderful stories ever. Just from an ethical issue, are you breaking some kind of privacy code there? What are your sources? Do you have sources? Can we see your sources? Are you listing your sources? If I'm a reader, can I go back to your original sources and check your work? There's the transparency piece of it. Why are you writing it? Are you making that clear to the writer? Why is it important for you to get these stories out there? And then motive as well. What's the motive of the writer? Generally for revenge or to air dirty secrets or to air dirty laundry. It's generally not considered a good motive when you're sitting down to write creative nonfiction. But if the motive is to figure something out, to capture a time and a place that no longer exists, to create a work of art, those are generally going to be more acceptable motives in writing family stories and writing creative nonfiction. So some things that you can do if you do have some family stories out there that you wanted to get out on paper. I know it can be a huge task. Believe me, I've written 2 books. And so you really have to break it down. You don't just sit down one day and write an entire book. You have to break it down into those smaller tasks. So one thing that you can do just to start is just make a list. I'm a huge fan of bulleted lists, kind of like you see here. Almost everything in my life is a bullet list. So just make a list. Think about all the family stories that you can think of and just jot them down in just a few words, just a really brief sentence. We call these islands. So these are little islands that you can start working with. Then once you have a list going, just go back to it and start tackling them one by one. Just start to fill out that story, start to write more about it. Maybe it's a paragraph, maybe it ends up being 20 pages. You just never know, but you can just start to tackle them one by one. And then once you have started to write them all out, you can start to seam them together. You can probably start to see maybe an organization or start to see where you're going to fill in the blanks. And thinking about the facts, where are those places that you can make the writing come more alive? So definitely with people. Can you describe them? Do you have old pictures you can refer to? How can you describe them? What were their motivations? What do you think drove them and inspired them? Same with places. Describe the place. I'm a huge fan of actually going to the place that I'm writing about. So when I was working on my memoir, that was fairly easy because I still live in southern Minnesota. So I could go back to my family farm or go back to the cemeteries where my relatives were buried pretty easy. With Camilla Hall, I did get a grant to go out to the Bay Area in California to see the places that she lived. It was so important just to get more detail and description of places by actually being there and seeing them myself. And then the historical context, which I'm sure many of you are very good at including. You have a date. What was going on? What else was going on in the world? How did these world or national or local events affect your characters and affect the things that they did? So going back to my previous example with my grandma, I mean, obviously it was a really clear example. 1933 was a whooping cough epidemic. These babies died, but I could put in more information there. I could do more research on whooping cough. I could do more research, how many babies died during that time. That's also going to do a nice job of filling in the blanks and making the writing come alive. But when you do have your memories down, then you go into the research mode and start to find out more about these people and the places and the time period where we lived. I'm also a big fan at some point, if you have a larger work that's a collection of essays or it's an entire book, to have an author's note, to just let your reader know what you're doing, what your motivation is, how you did your research, how you approach sourcing, maybe a little note about memories, just to make it clear where you're saying, well, these are my memories. Other people may remember it differently, but this is my book. And so I'm reporting it in the way that I remembered it. And if you read memoir, you are going to see this quite a bit, or really kind of any nonfiction as well. You probably will see some kind of author's note or acknowledgement section in which they talk a little bit more about their process. Because even if you are veering a little bit more to the imaginative side of creative nonfiction, like Nicole Helget or like myself, as long as the reader knows what you're doing, you can get away being that way. One thing you don't want to do is trick the reader or mislead the reader. Readers don't like that. So if you can just be open and upfront with your readers about what you're doing, that can really go a long way in helping the readers understand your approach. This is an exercise, and actually when we're done with the presentation here, I can get a PDF to all of you, or we can probably actually just include that with the email that will be sent out. But I have this exercise and a few other writing exercises on there too, that if you are thinking of writing family stories, some prompts that can help you get that way. So this is one here where you just, again, are making that list. Listing those family stories, but especially the ones that are repeated. We all have those stories, kind of the legends, that we grew up, the legendary stories we grew up hearing. And then to take it a step further, thinking about those stories. Why was that told? Why was it told so often? Why was it repeated? Did it change at all? Did it change based on the person who was telling it? And thinking about the myth, like what's myth did that story create about your family? And again, getting back to why you think it was told, it can be a fun exercise just to think about, especially those repeated stories that we all grow up with. Okay, I'm going to get here also to some publishing options, and I'll be able to wrap up here in about 5 minutes and we can take some questions. But thinking about your audience, thinking about, okay, I want to tell family stories. What do I do with it? How do I actually get these family stories out there? This is breaking it down pretty broadly, but in the interest of time, we'll be broad about it. So you can publish works yourself. So it's called self-publishing. Couple of pros here. It's quick. If I had a story ready to go right now, I could find an online place that would just print it out. Boom, I could have it ready to distribute. So it can be quick. It's going to be limited appeal. Probably if you are thinking, I have stories and I just want my family to read it. I want to capture all these stories for posterity to have in the future. This is a great option if you think, it's a pretty limited audience. I just want to get that out into the hands of family. Good option there. You can also go with a small press. So if you think that your story maybe has a little bit wider appeal, maybe you were able to find a central theme, maybe you do have family stories, you've written something that revolves around just one really clear theme, then it might have more appeal to outside of your family. And you could go the small press route. So university presses here would be an example of small press. And with small presses, you can reach out to editors directly and you can say, hey, I've written this book about my family. I think it has a larger regional appeal. Do you want to take a look at it? Or if you think you really have a winning book here that you think a lot of people would want to read, that you have a theme and an interesting story that you think can just go national or international, then you could go to what we call the big presses. These are those big presses usually housed in New York. Wide appeal, big audience, potential for big money, but it's going to be a very, very, very competitive process. Your story is going to have to be really pretty great to stand out here. And the only way to get into a big process, you would have to go through the literary agent process. So that's a whole other process to keep in mind. So the self-publishing is going to be really quick. If you just want to get something out there. Small press can be relatively quick, but you're still looking at probably at least like a 2-year timeline for that to get out. And big press can be even longer, especially when you have to go through the literary agent step first. It can be really quite a long process. So depending on your timeline and patience level, something to keep in mind. Here's some resources that I have, and I know that this will be sent out as well, or you'll have the recording of the video that you can get to this screen as well, so you don't have to feel rushed to write these down. But these are really good books when writing nonfiction, when writing memoir, writing family history. Vivian Gornick has the situation and the story that really goes into detail about that inner and outer story. So if you wanted to know more about that, that book is great for that. Judith Barrington, just writing the memoir, wonderful book, lots of writing exercises in that book. So that's one of my favorite memoir writing books. If you're writing about family and you want to know a little bit more about maybe those problem areas that can pop up when writing about family, Family Trouble is an anthology where a lot of writers have weighed in about their experiences writing about family. Patricia Hampel and Elaine Tyler May are editors of Tell Me True, which combines memoir, history, family stories, another lovely book. And then Stephen Pine wrote Voice and Vision, really history focused, but it's all about, writing nonfiction, but more in that captivating way. So I really like all of these books. I refer to them often. And then just some contact information here. Again, this will go out as well. So if you want to get a hold of me, as Amy mentioned earlier, there's my website. I do have a monthly newsletter. It's a really, really quick read. I have a writing tip. I have what I'm reading, which is usually nonfiction and memoir. And any book events that I have coming up or any news about my book, I'll put in there as well. So I always like subscribers. If you want to do that, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, if you're doing social media. So I'm really pretty easy to find. You can find an email for me if you go through my website as well. So I will stop sharing and I will see what kind of questions have come up from anyone in the audience. I hope we've had some good questions here.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that. Really gets the juices flowing.
Good.
I will say there is a glitch you may have noticed with the Q&A this morning. And so we've been working to get an email link to people who would like to submit a question that way. Okay. But if you haven't received your link yet, I know Henning is working behind the scenes to get that out to people. Feel free to just throw your question into an email and you can send it directly to NAHA, N-A-H-A, at stolaf.edu. So that's Stolaf, STOLAF.edu. So I do have one question just to kick things off while we're waiting for people to email their questions to us. And that is, you were talking about small presses, large presses, self-publishing. If someone decides to go with a self-published solution or even a small press, is there any hope or what's the likelihood of a large press actually picking up on something like that?
Yeah, so it does happen, especially with self-published books. I have heard stories where people have self-published, like even through Amazon. Amazon has their own self-publishing arm where you can just do an ebook actually really quickly. And I've heard of people, getting picked up with some pretty good deals to be published traditionally then. Usually that book is going to have to sell really, really well, in that self-publishing vein. So if a book really is selling well, a larger publisher might take notice. It's rare, but it certainly happens. And I also have heard of, like, with a small press, if they do a hardcover, sometimes a larger press will come in and buy the paperback rights. So I've heard of that happening too. But again, it's pretty rare. And I like to tell my students too, because sometimes, they think, oh, a book, and they see Stephen King and other big name authors. I was like, you're probably better off buying a lottery ticket. If your goal is to make money on a book, just go play the lottery. Your odds are probably going to be better. Like the motive for writing a book, it can be money, right? Because you just have no guarantees. But I always tell people too, like if it's a story that it just feels like compelled that it has to get out there, then that's the sign that you need to write it. And that's how I felt about these two books. Like there was no option. For me to not write it. I knew somehow it was going to get out there. Even if I had to publish it myself, I wanted these stories out there.
Great. Yeah, I don't think any of us go into writing family history.
Oh my gosh.
It's going to be a money-making venture. Usually it's just those stories that we just can't not write, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So if you had like a top 3 tips for trying to make these family stories more accessible to the public or to, we're all deeply interested in our own family histories. Do you have just a few tips on what kind of things really capture the interest of the larger public?
Yeah, it definitely would be trying to find that theme. Okay, you have this family story, this compelling family story. what's the theme, and I think of family stories and family histories. I mean, you have so many great themes to choose from that people, like a larger audience, would be captivated by. Adversity, overcoming adversity, grief and loss, obviously, are going to be big ones. Success stories. So if you can boil down your family story into kind of that 1 or 2 word phrase, that thing that you think it really represents, that's what's going to compel readers to read about it. And I also would say too, thinking about the publishing industry right now, what kind of stories are they looking for? What kind of stories are being published right now? Well, certainly right now would be the big push to get the stories of people out there that haven't generally been published. So the underrepresented voices, the traditionally underrepresented voices, stories of groups that we already don't know much about. So if there's anything like that you can think of in your family history that really, like a story that hasn't been told yet from the perspective of a person who we generally haven't heard from. I mean, I think just women in general, like there's always going to be room for women's stories, because in the traditional publishing process, women's stories really haven't been elevated. So that's, one place to start too. So if you can find that piece, like that is really something new, you're going to have, I think, something compelling to start with there.
Yeah.
We have some questions coming in via email. So one person asks, when writing creative nonfiction, would you compare the use of first person versus narrator perspectives?
All right. Yeah, I would definitely use first person point of view, you can definitely get away with in creative nonfiction. And so I don't know if they're also talking about like maybe adding different perspectives in there too, but like in my memoir, clearly I'm using first person because it's about me and my family, but I do take a step back and I do write from other perspectives as well. So I write from the point of view of my dad and my grandma and my grandpa with their stories as well. So there's definitely room to kind of move around and switch it up if you want to write from different perspectives. I mean, kind of there's no rules with creative nonfiction except tell the truth. That would be the one rule. But other than that, you're kind of free to make whatever creative choices you want.
Great. Okay, I've got one here for you, Rachel. Another email has come in wondering how can we incorporate personal letters written by a relative to both by and to a relative around, like the 1890s. So older letters. Do you have any thoughts on including correspondence? I know a lot of
I love letters.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I think that anything like that you have is just so wonderful. I come from a family who didn't write. There's no letters, there's no journals. I mean, and I just think, oh, would that not have been so nice to be able to really hear from them in their own words? So what you can do, like on that creative side of it, like, okay, you have letters, and so there you have a great document, and you certainly could just document, here's the letter. But that's where you come in then as the writer. So if this is a letter from family members, like you could include the letter or include relative excerpts from the letter. And then I would want to hear your commentary on it. So you're the writer, you're the family member reporting on this. What are you thinking? What does it mean? Why might they have written that? I want to hear your interpretation of what's going on in that letter.
And then I have a question. How do you choose what photos to use? How many do you include? And does that affect the way you publish?
Yeah, again, huge fan of photos over here. I have included photos in both of my books. So if you pick up memoir, generally you're not really going to see photos. And this always really disappoints me as a reader, because when I'm reading about people, I want real people, I want to see what they look like. So in my memoir, I wanted to include photos, and my press, I'm with a university press, University of Minnesota Press. So the nice thing about small presses is they are pretty open to you as the author to what you want to do. And when you're at that point, talking with a press about it, their considerations are going to be, well, how are we going to present these pictures? And then it's going to be cost, right? So like color pictures are going to be more expensive. Pictures on glossy paper in the middle is going to be more expensive. So they are going to be concerned with that. So it's probably going to be some negotiation between you and the publisher in terms of how many you can use, what type you can use. In both of my books, I don't have very many pictures. The placement of where they're going to go is also going to be a consideration. But of course, if you're self-publishing, then you get to make all the choices. It just might be a little bit more expensive though to print that out, depending on how you want to present the pictures. That would probably be the main consideration for you if you were going to self-publish.
Great. Well, and one remaining question that came in is, will this presentation be available in the future? And that's a question for me. And I can say, yes, we do intend to make that available. We'll be sending out a link via email, and it will also be linked from our events page on our website. So we're at the top of the hour. I think it's time to wrap up. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions. Feel free to submit them to the NAHA email, and we can forward those to Rachel if they are specifically about the creative writing process. Those that are dealing with Norwegian or Norwegian American questions, we can respond to ourselves. I saw a couple of those come through, and that's sort of its own question. So we'll follow up on those. Rachel, I just want to thank you again for sharing your insights and your expertise with us this morning. I know I am really excited to take on some family writing. I hope that folks in this webinar have also taken some pearls of wisdom, and also, as one commenter said, a way to add some of the emotion and the story to the hard, cold facts that we have collected about our family histories.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And thanks again to all of you for sharing your time with us this morning. Have a great day, and we wish you well.
Thank you.